now corporate event summit, so it's just kind of shut down. Corporate did it, yeah. So we run us alongside our events team as a whole is kind of split into corporate and commercial. So corporate do VC events, essentially like room opening, doing openings and things, and we do commercial, so external events. Okay, ready?
I'm on this page. So separate, you can sit there. Actually, separate. Be sad. Here with us.
Yeah. Who?
You. So we can make them
I want to leave
together.
up this full on.
Yeah.
Next time. Next time.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Walking
Can we do, are you certified?
Yeah.
Can you just pick up a roaming microphone?
Yes. Yeah.
I'll do it.
It's still to be volunteers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Brian can hear. Yes. I'll do the timing in my ear.
Good morning, everyone. Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome to this session. This session is going to be entitled International Perspectives on Radicalization, Gender, Trauma, and Youth. And our first presenter is going to be Isel Ross. Isel is presenting a paper on trauma-informed responses, crucial for preventing violent extremism in Africa. Thank you, Isel.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Isel Ross, and I think, as most of you know me, as the newly appointed AVERT coordinator. I also work as the PVE and Conflict Resolution Advisor for Impact Pathways, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Plan International Australia. For those that are not very familiar with Plan International, it's one of the biggest humanitarian aid organizations globally. And I was brought on board with a team so that we can increase the knowledge of Plan International staff around the drivers of violent extremism so that they are better equipped at addressing the drivers of violent and hateful extremism while delivering humanitarian aid projects. On a personal note, I recently moved to Australia from South Africa, where I worked for the organization called Institute for Security Studies. And the majority of my work revolved around understanding how local practitioners understand and address the drivers of violent extremism in their communities. Finally, I want to thank the organizers of this event for the opportunity to discuss a topic that's very, very close to my heart on how trauma-informed approaches can contribute to more effective prevention and resilience building in Africa. Mental health plays an important role in understanding both resilience and vulnerability to violent extremism. This topic, although gaining major support in the developing world, has been mostly neglected in Africa. Luckily, thanks to organizations such as UNDP, UNODC, and the World Health Organization, people are becoming more aware of its benefits. Unlike most of the presenters who have presented before me, I want to discuss a research proposal that was recently approved and will start in November. This research project will be undertaken with a few partner organizations based in Southern Africa, and will examine how local practitioners across 6 case study countries in East and Southern Africa are integrating mental health and psychosocial support into their prevention and conflict resolution efforts. In Africa, as perhaps elsewhere in the world too, local practitioners are considered the closest allies to the communities, given their shared cultural, religious, and ethnic identities. If we want to motivate for more policy or programmatic change, we need to understand how local practitioners and local experts have already started integrating mental health approaches into their existing interventions. Lastly, this presentation is intended as an overview, so certain details may not be covered today. My aim is to set the stage and highlight the relevance of this study. A quick snapshot of the current human security situation in Africa. I am not sure how many of you stay up to date on what's happening on the continent. In 2023, Sub-Saharan Africa kept its position as the most affected region by violent extremism globally, according to the Global Terrorism Index. The most affected regions remain the Sahel, Lake Chad Basin, and the Horn of Africa. Key extremist groups include Boko Haram, Islamic State affiliates in West and Central Africa, Al-Qaeda affiliates in the Sahel, and Al-Shabaab in East and Southern Africa. Apart from the threat of terrorism and violent extremism, Africa also faces severe threats from transnational organized crime and other non-state armed groups. Islamic State affiliates are especially known to exploit weak governance and the illicit economy, further fueling violence and instability. Even though we have seen some countries take positive steps towards developing national PVE action plans, these often remain unimplemented and unsupported by leadership. Unfortunately, African states prefer using counterterrorism or hard security measures to address the root causes of extremism, which are known to intensify conflict and contribute greatly to the drivers of violent extremism in the first place. Finally, the main drivers of violent extremism in Africa broadly include socioeconomic marginalization, isolation, underdevelopment, distrust in the government, with human rights abuses as the main driver of voluntary recruitment into extremist groups. A 2023 UND report titled Journey to Extremism in Africa, i.e. My Bible, identifies 2 main categories that make people more vulnerable to recruitment by terrorist groups: social and behavioral factors. Social factors such as economic and political exclusion, human rights abuses, distrust in the government, and childhood neglect or unhappiness can create frustration and can lead to grievances. Behavioral factors are triggered by the social factors I just mentioned and can lead to feelings of anger, distrust, and disconnection from one's identity or group, fostering hostility towards other groups and the government, and increasing vulnerability to recruitment or radicalization into violent extremism. Transgenerational trauma, which is the topic of my presentation today, is also considered a behavioral factor that results from being exposed to the social factors listed on the slide. Transgenerational trauma, also known as intergenerational trauma, is the passing down of traumatic experiences and their effects from one generation to the next. This occurs when individuals who have experienced trauma, such as war, displacement, abuse, or oppression, inadvertently transmit the emotional, psychological, and behavioral impacts of that trauma to their children and subsequent generations. This can manifest as heightened anxiety, emotional distress, or difficulty coping with stress and hardship, even in those who did not directly experience the original traumatic events. Most importantly to note that transgenerational trauma often influences family dynamics, cultural identity, and community resilience. The basic assumption of the study I mentioned earlier is that unaddressed transgenerational trauma could increase one's vulnerability to extremism. In this slide, I want to touch on 3 specific causes of intergenerational trauma in the African context. One of the main factors is prolonged exposure to violence. As we stand here today, many countries are directly affected by conflicts such as insurgencies, terrorist attacks, and political violence. Children growing up in these environments are particularly vulnerable, as repeated exposure to violence disrupts their development, leading to severe mental health challenges. Another key factor is socioeconomic marginalization. Currently, more than 550 million people living in sub-Saharan Africa live in multi-dimensional poverty, which includes lacking access to education, healthcare, and basic services. For communities in conflict-affected areas, poverty intensifies trauma, especially when paired with displacement and the lack of access to livelihood opportunities. Lastly, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are unfortunately common in the African context. These include abuse, witnessing violence, and parental absence. In sub-Saharan Africa, unfortunately, nearly 72% of women and 82% of men report experiencing at least one adverse childhood experiencing while growing up. There is a complex connection between trauma and radicalization, where psychological injuries stemming from the prolonged exposure to conflict, socioeconomic marginalization, and adverse childhood experiences create vulnerabilities that extremist groups are known to exploit. I have a couple of points listed on my slide, but I'll only discuss 3, which I consider the most significant. First, extremists use trauma narratives to create the us versus them ideology, recognizing and amplifying collective suffering and blaming external forces for the trauma. On a continent where ethnic and religious marginalization is rife, and where power and leadership are often held by only one ethnic or religious group, this narrative is easily exploited. Secondly, any trauma involving moral injury or a loss of personal significance, such as witnessing harm or experiencing betrayal, which leads to feelings of guilt, shame, and diminished self-worth. Extremists exploit moral injury trauma by framing violent extremism as a way to restore dignity and seek justice. This is especially relevant in the African context, as human rights abuses are considered the tipping point for individuals to voluntarily join violent extremist groups. Lastly, trauma from poverty and lack of access to basic services create vulnerabilities that extremist groups often exploit. In Somalia, for example, where the Somali government is often absent in several regions, Al-Shabaab has taken charge of those regions and are delivering basic services to the communities. So what is mental health and psychosocial support, and what constitutes trauma-informed or healing-centered approaches? Mental health and psychosocial support, which I will be referring to hopefully now as MHPSS, constitutes a broad approach that aims to protect, promote mental health and psychosocial well-being during emergencies. The objectives of MHPSS are comprehensive, from dealing with individual mental health issues to improving resilience to instability and hardship. In essence, MHPSS addresses both the immediate and long-term impacts of crises, supporting recovery and resilience in affected communities. While MHPSS is commonly discussed in fields like humanitarian aid, transitional justice, and peace building, MHPSS is applied as part of a post-conflict stabilization. Unfortunately, it is less recognized within the context of preventing violent extremism. In other words, where MHPSS is applied as a preventative measure. I want to add here, before I discuss the examples, that mental health and psychosocial support is not delivered in the way we know it in the developed world. MHPSS can take the form of storytelling, playing games, trust exercises, and usually take place in group settings. During my research, I've come across several case studies and wanted to highlight the following 3, where the importance of integrating MHPSS into prevention efforts have been realized. In Kenya, the Green String Network, a local organization, has been running mental health and psychosocial support programs in coastal areas and Nairobi for several years. Mistrust in the government, fueled by human rights abuses and ethnic discrimination, has posed challenges for PCVE programming in the country. The Green String Network's programs help participants process trauma, strengthen social cohesion, and build community ties, mostly by bringing together members of law enforcement agencies as well as marginalized communities. In post-genocide Rwanda, MHPSS programs were essential in fostering resilience and social reconnection. The programs emphasized community healing through practices like mutual saving groups, communal work, and church-based support. In fact, to date, I can't remember if it's the last Thursday or last Saturday of each month, everyone except for emergency workers would close businesses and would all take to streets to clean up the streets and make sure everything is clean as part of a coming together and building towards their own country. Nigeria, finally, has recognized that providing former combatants with MHPSS can help prevent them from returning to violence. Operation Safe Corridor, the country's national rehabilitation and reintegration program, integrates MHPSS into its broader activities to support defectors from going into recidivism and to prepare communities for the return of former combatants. So apart from contributing to more successful prevention efforts, MHPSS is also crucial in the rehabilitation and reintegration of former combatants and returnees from extremist groups. I mentioned the two because in the African context, people are also forcefully recruited into extremist groups, and I will use the case study of the Chibok girls in Nigeria who were kidnapped by Boko Haram. So MHPSS aids the rehabilitation and reintegration process in two ways: by supporting the individuals that are returning from extremist groups where they were either forcefully recruited or whether they joined voluntarily, and by supporting the communities that are supposed to accept back these individuals. We've seen amnesty and rehabilitation and reintegration programs go completely awry, especially in Kenya and Somalia, where the communities that were expected to accept back the former combatants were not prepared, and the individuals that were integrated back into the community were either ostracized or even killed. As we advocate for MHPSS to be prioritized in prevention efforts, we need to be aware of the challenges and barriers that impact both the delivery and reception of mental health support across Africa. There are multiple challenges facing practitioners hoping to deliver and provide mental health support services, as well as the barriers that communities are facing in receiving these services. I will highlight four. In many African communities, cultural and religious beliefs heavily influence how mental health is perceived and can often lead to stigmatization. In patriarchal societies, gender-based stigma considers the act of seeking help as undermining traditional gender roles. Other logistical challenges compound these issues. Limited resources are a significant barrier, with African governments often allocating less than $1 per person annually for mental health services. There is also a severe shortage of trained mental health professionals. Finally, language barriers and Western terminology further complicate access to care. Western medical terms can feel alienating in many African contexts, where there is a need for language that resonates with collective cultural experiences rather than individual medical models. Finally, as I conclude my presentation, I would like to share some recommendations that came out during the research I have been doing on the topic for the past 2 years. First, we need to research the drivers of extremism, specifically how extremist groups exploit the vulnerabilities within communities, especially intergenerational trauma. By identifying the psychological factors that increase susceptibility to extremism, we can develop targeted prevention strategies. Second, it's essential to assess current MHPSS interventions, especially in the humanitarian aid and transitional justice sectors, to avoid duplication and learn from good practices. Third, addressing the stigma surrounding mental health is a priority. Cultural beliefs and misconception often deter people from seeking or accepting help and support. Conducting research into these cultural stigmas will help us understand how to make mental health interventions more inclusive and culturally sensitive. Fourth and last, we need to create culturally relevant MHPSS frameworks, specifically tailored to the communities affected by extremism. This means working closely with local practitioners to design frameworks that align with cultural, religious, and social values of these communities. So despite mounting evidence that counterterrorism approaches often exacerbate conflict and fuel recruitment into extremist groups, they remain the primary strategy African states use to address persistent violence. So through this upcoming study, we aim to spotlight how local practitioners, those in the front lines with vulnerable communities, are embedding mental health and psychosocial support into their prevention efforts, offering insights that could inform more sustainable and more human-centered responses to conflict. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Isel. Continuing on our sort of examination of international places, we next have Nungky Hodijah from Deakin University, who will be presenting her research on exploring how gender and traumatic events influence individuals' decision to take on supporter or fighter roles, the case of Ambon, Indonesia. Thank you, Nungky.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nungky, and I'm a third year of volunteers in our symposium. But now it's before my confirmation. But now I'm a PhD candidate, supervised by Matteo Vergani, Mari Pardi, and Greg Barton, whose support I deeply appreciate. Before my PhD, I spent over a decade with the Indonesian National Commission of Violence Against Women, conducting extensive research on violence against women in post-conflict areas, including around terrorism and extremism, work that lead to my current research. And I'd also like to thank my informants who courageously share their suffering and pain experiences of the Ambon conflict over 4 months, as well as honor all victims of the Ambon conflict from 1999 to 2001. Now, I'll present my research on the role of gender and trauma in radicalization, focusing on my first research question, how gender respond to traumatic events influence individual decision to take as a supporter and fighters, which I'm on as a case study. Okay, so I use the theoretical, my approach for theoretical frameworks is from Krudlansky. Actually, it's the theory of self love story. So actually it's because Matteo is my supervisors. So I also use the concept of pull-push, why people change behavior to be to do the violent behavior. So it's because a personal loss, because of the love of families, love their partners, love of country, and love to the religion beliefs. So it is from a traumatic experience can drive individual toward political violence and terrorism. Significance refers to the individual's sense of value in society, and a lack of it, it can increase the likelihood of engaging in violent behavior and supporting political violence. And also use the 3N model of radicalization needs, the self-love story, and then why personal to be important for their themselves, and then for their community. And then means narratives as something the story, telling stories from the generational, Isel mentioned, how the narrative they always share, even though we didn't realize, but it's come to in your brain. And then because they are the legitimizing network, so they can something approval why they can do something the violent behavior. And the traumatic events, even though it's my research also my reflection all the time, because even though you explore my experience, I explore my informants' trauma, but it's reflect to my trauma as well. So it's something like amazing things when doing analyzing my research. So traumatic events can lead to the varying levels of radicalization from passive supports to self-sacrifice, even within the same group. So it's like a different. So that's why even though the same community, but they have like a different choice to be a fighters or supporter. So this is my research area. Ambon, actually close to Australia, Darwin. Ambon is like close to Darwin, and is in the US of Indonesia, but I came from West Indonesia, so yeah, but it's too hard to solve, but it's okay. Yeah, so to know about the Ambon, why I choose Ambon as a case study, because like after my second president Suharto resigned, after President Suharto resigned, and then there are spark conflict. It's not just in Ambon, but also in other parts in Indonesia, especially in my area in Jakarta. But it's like mostly it's ethnic issue, but in Ambon, actually in the beginning, it's the issue to spark conflict is about the outsider, and then it's the original from as a Ambonese, but then like a change to be the religious conflict, because the first spark during the holiday of Muslim, and then Christian, actually like Christian and Muslim Ambonese, like original Ambonese, they united, have a strong power to try to expel the other Muslim from the other ethnicity, is from Buton Bugis Makassar. But then because like the spark conflict happened in the holiday and also Christian, so it's like one informant always mentioned that because like Christian burn our mosque, so that's why it's like to be the religion conflict. And then why I choose gender and trauma in my research, because like gender respond to their traumatic events and traumatic experience, like to make like someone, person and people in the community to be changed to do the violence behavior. So it's because like gender and trauma is under research. So I just like try to explore more about that. And okay, so it's like my approach using the ethnography and grounded theory. And then the participant is from both Muslim and Christian. It's my planning is like just 10 from Christian and 10 from Muslim. But then I'm so curious. Yeah, because like I just like listening stories and curious. So then like 16 participants from Muslim, and then fighters 8 men and 2 women, and then supporters 1 man and 5 women. And in Christian, 13 participant, fighter is 6 men and supporters is 1 man and 6 women. So I will then explain why in Christian there are no women to be a fighters. And a limitation. So as I mentioned, like I employ ethnography and then grounded theory, but it's like my research time, my fieldwork is just 4 months, because like my research budget fund. And then like, but I don't know how because like many methods, but ethnography is like suits, because I need to exploring trauma. So I need to build reports and then build trust. So ethnography is like the match method and the suit method that I need to use, and also the grounded theory, because I want to listen from the community, not from the literature. So yeah, so like grounded theory that I employ, but it's so after fieldwork it's so messy, but I don't know what is that data, especially in when I analyze that data. And then informants' memories, because like this is like 24 when I interview some informant, it's like because like 24 years ago. So my experience during fieldwork is also like experience suffering and pain as well, because they call me like provocateurs, terrorists, and you are, I think, intelligent from government, because like why you talk about the 24 years ago. So it's so suffering. So they like try to bury, but why you recollect my memories. So yeah, 2 months. And then because like I'm from the West, and then my research area in the East. So because like Indonesia have hundreds local language, so that's why like I need to learn the local language, even though we have the same citizen, but we have like, because like my national language is Bahasa Indonesia, but in the East something like mixed with the local, so I need to, and then like they talk fast than in West Indonesia. So I need to learn 1 month to understand what they talk, and then the memories. They sometimes like forgot the time, and then they but you know the vivid stories about what they experience with a traumatic events. It's various. Each informant have like memory, even like the same community, but they have like a different traumatic experience they endure. And then like inconsistent response, because like building trust in 4 months is not easy. And then sometime during interview they said that like I didn't join as a fighters, but then yes, I'm a fighter. And then in the middle, and then they just like, yes, I involved in that war. And then the other, no. So it's like, it's when I analyze now using NVivo, and then oh my god, it's like it's always change. And then like it the ends, even though we try to make sure, they always does no, we just like because it's not good for us, so we didn't join in that war. But actually they all joined that war. So, and then like when I interview, sometimes they need to pause my recorder because it's related to the safety. Because like in 2002, after the conflict, they are from military, so they just like killing and shot many people who join in the radical groups. So gender response to trauma conflict. So is the role during the war is like different. Like men tend to become fighters and taking on direct roles in conflict. But if women to be a fighters, like having like women are masculine. Women are masculine. They always say that. And then, or like husband as a leader. So that's why that woman to be a fighter. And humiliate men who don't participate in the war. So women more likely assume supportive roles. It is shaped by cultural norms. So that's why Christian is so difficult in Christian women involved to be a fighters. But if man as a supporter, such as religious leader, and they always call that religious leader is coward because they don't want it to be join in the war. They're just praying and praying, but it's like our people is killing, and then government officer, and they call it like coward people, or men who having feminine features, but then like they something like they give a stigma that it's not you are not men, so you should like join the war. So yeah, after that, like even though like they having a feminine feature, but they then change to be a fighter then. So influence of traumatic events, trauma that I will like explain after then. Yeah, sorry. Trauma is from direct and indirect, generational or present, individual or collective. And then for direct, it's trauma, both men and women, is also because like love of ones or properties, like house burn, their house burn. So it's like catalyst, like a trigger them to be involved in the war. So it's like, as I mentioned, like sometimes indirect trauma, for example, like they just like hearing, but it's like traumatized, but it's like they are a trend, traumatic, indirect traumatic events, because like women pregnant killed by the Muslim fighters. So it's something like trigger Christian to be like all Christian fighters, if they remember about that, so they just like trigger their emotion to involve in the war. So generational, it's like they, because like Christian, it's a privileged child of during like Dutch colonization. So it's like the issue is always like repeat like many someone or people like repeat stories about why Christian have the privileged children. So that's why you need like to fight to the Christian, killing Christian, because it's injustice and suffering. And Muslim is always said that we need to jihad because like Christian, like it's the narrative things like here. Oh yeah, it's the fighter leaders, but it's like the narrative is they use for religion and also the national identity, because like during the Dutch colonization, Christian is a privileged child, and also like they have like good opportunity to work in the government office, and then also like they have like high education than Muslim. And then it's like they are the Christianization, but during Suharto they are the Islamization. And then they try to make a balance, Christian and Muslim, and so that's why you need to fight, even as a religion identity, as a Christian integrity, and as a Muslim solidarity. And then, so I back to the fighter leaders, so who have like a military experience and familiar with weapons, because like military has a weapon, so they can like access close to the weapons, and then courage and respect. Okay. And also like a spiritual strange, because like as they always like a spiritual war. So people who to be a leader is like possess a spiritual power, as a vulnerability of weapons or the ability to become invisible to their enemies. And then role of social networks. So they just like sometime like how they recruit or connect to the radical groups. Sometimes like women or children doing bombing or artificial weapons, they all talk and share about the war. So they how to join and part of the recruitment. So they just like say that you come to the bridge so we can meet and then you can like join in the war. So it's like because it's our solidarity with our people. So they just like doing bombing or doing artificial weapons. So they still like try to recruit. So in Christian, there are a Laskar Christus, Agas troops is like children, since 15 to 17. But the informant that I interview now is like about 30. So because like 24 years ago. And then police like in the Christian sides, and then Muslim back up from the military sides. So yeah, there are something. And then Laskar Jihad, there are a local Laskar Jihad as well in Ambon, and there are Laskar Jihad from Java, so from outsider, from island outside Ambon. And conclusion. Okay, Saprin, thank you. Finish. So we can read. So that's why like gender role shape responses to trauma and violence, and trauma and vulnerability, unresolved trauma increase vulnerability to radicalization, and can be passed across generations. So how, even though it's 24 years ago, but it influenced to the until now. So it's like why people like trigger to be the violent violent behavior. So because of they have a trauma, that unresolved trauma is still there. And then it's depend of like you have like capability to be a fighter, is even though it's like women, somehow I always like think that even though supporter, but sometimes like there are some case like women like push their husband, their partner to join the war. So something like men is to be a victim as well, because pushed like by their wife or their partner to join the war, even though they feeling afraid. And then the implication of preventing radicalization, understanding the need for targeted intervention, considering gender, trauma, and social network. Thank you.
Thank you, Nungky. So for our final presentation, we have Dr. Prime Cabanes Ragandang joining us remotely. And he'll be presenting his research on the role of young people in countering violent extremism online, the case of the Bangsamoro in the Philippines. Thank you, Dr. Prime.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And I guess you can now see my slide. But how about this one? Maybe this is better?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, good morning, everyone. Maybe let me start by acknowledging the original custodians of the lands wherever we are Zooming or meeting and sitting today. And I would like to thank for this opportunity to be here with you online. I'm Zooming from Mindanao in the Philippines. So for this morning, my topic is about the role of young people in challenging violent extremism online. And so here, I asked the question about what do we exactly mean when we say young people are utilizing social media for challenging violent extremism. I asked this question on the grounds that, for one, there are already a number of studies which telling us that young people are active participants in challenging violent extremism. Secondly, there are also a number of studies which also says that the social media is a very good platform for young people to navigate in challenging violent extremism. It's another one. And so this is like not something new, but so therefore, the focus really of this research is to explore what really do we exactly mean? What really young people are actually doing when we say that they utilize social media, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, to challenge violent extremism. And so, and in addition to that, I would like to say that there are the studies that focus on young people are voluminous, and we are very happy with this increasing number of scholars interested and dedicating their scholarship for young people. Of course, we have a number of scholars like McEvoy Levy, we have Helen Behrens, and of course we have Bad September Kalamba doing study about the young people in Mindanao. And so, but however, in the past decade, the studies about young people are very few, and so therefore this increasing number of studies about young people is a welcome venue in the scholarship wherein people are very interested about studying youth. This is especially relevant, especially when about 5 years ago, when I presented the same paper about young people in peace building, one of the person in the audience asked me a question like, why focus on young people? And it is one of the hard questions to answer. And so in the global population, about 16% are young people, with over 47% are under 30 years old living in Asia. And then the social media is a key platform that young people use, but for challenge violent extremism, but they're also been used by the extremist groups for recruitment. Therefore, we can say that the digital world is become a space to both spread violence at the same time enable CVE efforts. And for the challenge is that in Asia, for example, there are limited access, and that there are there are some places where internet access can be challenging. There's some when we say about young people using social media for peace building, for challenging violent extremism, this is something that what the literature is been repeatedly saying. Number one is that the literature would always argue that the youth engagement is crucial for sustainable peace. And it is indeed true from the intergenerational lens. No one will continue the peace building efforts that the elders started, but the young people per se. Also in the literature, it is common about saying that social media empowers youth-led peace initiatives. And this is very true during this time where information technology is at its peak, and that young people is one of the highest social media users in the world. And to this effect, in 2015, the United Nations finally recognized that indeed young people are important. And so UN resolutions were documented recognizing youth's role in peace efforts. And Caitlin Mulika and Helen Behrens have a very interesting paper on this. Also in the literature, we can see that social media facilitates advocacy and community participation, and the tech companies can counter misinformation and promote inclusivity. And so in this paper, in trying to answer the question I posed before, that what do we exactly mean when young people is using social media to challenge violent extremism, I focused this paper, this research into 13 youth-led organizations based in Asia, and that some of the criteria, it is a qualitative research. Then the criteria for selecting these 13 youth-led organizations include three criteria. Number one is that each must be led and run by young people themselves, and that they are active on social media at least in 2023. Therefore, they are posting, they are using social media in 2023, and that their advocacy is related directly or indirectly to challenging violent extremism. So we started having 50, then because of this criteria, then we tailored down the research up to 13. There are a number of social media platforms, but for this research, focus is on Facebook alone, because for one reason is that Facebook, Meta, is widespread use in Asia. And for example, we know that when we are on Twitter, people are, the academics are on Twitter, tweeting. But if you conduct fieldwork in the Philippines and you want to connect with the participants, don't forget to open Facebook, because people tend to respond and open their messenger Facebook rather than email. Facebook is very active, at least in the Philippines. And for this paper, we collect over 130 social media posts. That's from 2013 to 2023, to 10 years. including interviews and some secondary sources from the published materials. Because it involves Asia and there are, a number of languages, language barrier is one. We only speak English and Filipino, and so it's also limited access to interviews, and therefore the data is really reliance on social media content. But nevertheless, due to snowball sampling, we're able to indeed conduct about 6 interviews. And so to continue, let me share with us about some threats of violent extremism in Asia. And one is that, at least in Asia, there are diverse extremist groups ranging from Jemaah Islamiyah to Al-Qaeda to IS. Root causes of this existence include socio-political grievances, religious tensions, ethnic conflicts, and that recruitment includes, online platforms for propaganda and radicalization, especially in Southeast Asia. And that, challenges in the online world includes anonymity and accessibility of online spaces, which actually complicate counter-extremism efforts. And that, there are also internal versus external groups, which added to the complexity of drivers of violent extremism. And now let us start the data per se. And in this research, we found out that of the 13 youth-led organizations which advocates for challenging violent extremism, 7 of the 13 organizations primarily use online platforms for CVE. In short, their work, their advocacy primarily revolved in online space. 8 of the organizations document their offline activities on social media, meaning whenever they have offline activities in the community, then they document them and post it in social media. But the social media is not their primary platform. Third is that when young people post anything that they do about challenging violent extremism, it includes images, videos, quotes, also infographics, and some of them includes webinars that they hosted or co-hosted. Additionally, Facebook remains as a dominant platform which engages by young people across the different countries in this study. Southeast Asia shows high Facebook usage among young people. And then this illustration here shows the words that young people usually, the favorite words whenever they post any content related to CVE in Facebook. And words such as peace, harmony, of course, youth, and peace building are the favorite words. And so therefore, if the focus really is challenging violent extremism, but they tend to use the words peace and peace building, what does it mean? What does it mean? To answer that question, we will explore later 3 levels. We also look into whether their social media engagements are high or low. We found out that based on reacts, over 60% of these posts are poor. And in our methods, poor means their post in a very low number of reacts, fewer than 50. In terms of shares, we can also see that most of the shares are like 96% are not being engaged. Only about 4% had been shared, which also shows a very poor online engagement. So, which is also a challenge, which requires an answer later on how we can make that the youth-led CVE efforts are engaging. And then, so if indeed young people are using the term peace or peace building in their efforts to challenge violent extremism, what does it actually mean? So here in this paper, we developed 3 categories when we in categorizing how young people utilize social media for CVE efforts. The first level includes the lowest, not the lowest, the first level includes young people wherein their advocacy is about direct condemnation of violent extremism. This includes young people condemning directly extremist ideas, violent ideas on social media, using, for example, in Indonesia, hashtags like Kami Tidak Takut. In Iraq, a youth campaign against military operations. And so therefore, in this case, at the first level, young people are not afraid in openly telling the world that we are against these violent ideas. The second level, a higher level, is not really directly condemning violence, but more on preventing measures. A number of youth-led organizations tend to be on the preventive side, wherein their posts are more of addressing the root causes of violent extremism. So, for example, one organization in Mindanao called I Am Mindanao promotes intercultural dialogue under the premise, under the belief that extremist ideas of violence exist because of intercultural miscommunication or lack of intercultural understanding between and among groups. In Indonesia, social media has been used to counter intolerance via Facebook. And so therefore, we can see that at the second level, instead of directly condemning violence through hashtags or whatever, there are also young people that utilize Facebook and other social media platforms to try in the preventive side, addressing the root causes of violence. So that's the second level. Let's proceed to the third level, and which we consider as the highest level. In the third level, there are some youth-led organizations that does not necessarily condemn violence, nor tend to prevent or at the, looking into the root causes, but instead try to, promote positive values and behaviors. Some of them, their programs focus on, positive values, positive messaging online, spreading messages of kindness and empathy, focus on community building. And so therefore, in this case, we can see that young people are no longer condemning violence, neither preventing the root causes of violence, but instead more on the promotion of positive values and behavior. So these are the three levels which we saw in the data as to what we exactly mean when young people challenge violent extremism from the three levels that we developed. And so we can also see that while young people utilize social media to showcase their advocacy, in Asian case, we saw in the data that a number of these organizations are doing a number of advocacy offline, meaning they go to the communities, they go to the villages and conduct seminars, trainings, dialogue in person, which is something which I would say a beauty in the Asian context, where communication, talking, the relatives, engagement of the clans, and so the sense of community is very vibrant. And so here, whenever they do offline, in-person activities, then they post their achievements online. So like blending what happened offline into the online world and telling the world that, hey, we're doing this one. And so there are some challenges that they encountered. One is that the communication gaps. I think this is very important, integrating online and offline CVE activities with limited internet access, which hampers engagement. In this world, as we speak, we live in a world where internet is open, but we also acknowledge that there are a number of communities, at least in Southeast Asia and in Asia in general, where internet is a challenge. And secondly is that financial barriers, wherein there is a misconception about low cost when we use the online platforms to advance our CV efforts. Small organizations struggle with resource allocation for impactful content, which is something that we need to consider. And so they need support. Third is that team dynamics. This is another challenge wherein they need for diverse skills set in context creation, especially that in this case, as I've said a while ago, their engagement is low, and that balancing balancing measures like striking a balance between positive outreach and negative content removal. This is also another challenge, especially with algorithms sometimes removing their post, not understanding really that that post is actually about challenging violent extremism. So for the recommendations, one is that it would be very helpful for tech companies to consider strengthening youth-led CVA efforts instead of creating new ones. And of course, trainings leveraging AI as in maximizing the use of AI positively, at the same time fostering collaboration between and among actors. And of course, lastly, strengthening offline activities, that while the focus is really about how we use social media, but then we realize that the offline activities are equally important as those online ones. And this is my second to the last slide. While preparing this, while doing this research and preparing this presentation, I cannot help but reflect on the methods on how we create knowledge. So I think during my university days in Australia, this is something that I struggle a lot. When we were told in the classroom that we write, we create knowledge, we gather data to, of course, add in the body of knowledge, theorize things, add to the concepts. And me coming from a practitioner background, I found it really very hard to understand why the challenge ends there, and not to actually help the communities where our study is focused. And I think in this kind of study, so there at that time, the question is like, Prime, you need to remove your practitioner hat and focus on being a scholar hat. And it is something that I found it very hard to understand. And so for studies, for example, like this, if our focus is simply to theorize things and never target plans that will directly help the community, I think our scholarship is problematic. So, I think some reflections, especially in the field of peace building and violent extremism, wherein it is very hard for us to delineate our data merely for theorizing things, but also to helping the area that our study is focused. So additionally and lastly, this study is anchored in a report that I published in the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. I am not sure if the QR code will work, but it is available online, entitled Young People Challenging Violent Extremism Online. That's all from me. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime. Okay, I'd like to open it up for questions. I think Septrin's walking around with microphones. Any questions for our panel? Yeah, Lydia.
Thanks, Septrin. If it's okay, I'll ask two, and if there's time, people can answer them. I've got one for Isel and one for Prime. Isel, I was really struck by the communal approaches around the interventions, the trauma enforced, where there's like a community approach to the intervention space around that. And here in the Australian context and other Western contexts, the approach seems to be very individualistic in the intervention space, like you're targeting that particular person rather than wrapping around a community around them. Maybe some practitioners in the room can correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about if there's any applicability or lessons learned from the African context that we can apply here in Australia and in other Western contexts. And my question for Prime is, with the young people's online kind of responses, did you take a look at the counter-narrative literature? And is there anything that you applied from the counter-narrative literature and previous studies on that? And do you think that is it all useful, or how does your study interact with that broader counter-narrative literature?
Prime, do you want to go first?
Yes, Lydia, what do you actually mean when you say counter-narrative literature?
So in violent extremism, there's a lot of study about violent extremist narratives, the narratives and the propaganda that violent extremist actors put out. And then there's another body of work that takes a look at people who are looking to oppose that and counter that and its effectiveness. And so it seems like the study that you're doing is situated within that. And so that's what I mean.
Thank you so much, Lydia. So I think in this particular study, we found out that young people does not directly engage with these counter narratives, but instead just, put new narratives that are positive in nature. So like, for example, in one project that young people led, funded by Facebook and the State Department, the U.S. State Department, the goal is to flood social media with positive messaging. So, the posts, the activities, any initiative which is all about positive messaging, to flood the social media spaces with positive messages of understanding, cooperation, empathy, but unfortunately not necessarily engaging with the narrative from the other side, especially from the violent groups. Thank you.
Well, that might be a more effective approach.
Thank you. And Isel?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lydia, for your question. And that's a good question. I 100% think that it has an applicability in the Australian context, especially because we have big groups of African migrants or asylum seekers in the various states. I found that group settings in which mental health activities are delivered are less threatening in a sense because we're all together. I also think that what people can learn from the African context is integrating mental health services into activities that are not labeled as such. I can't imagine a young person would participate in anything that's labeled as mental health. But if it's something like art, I don't know who mentioned it late. I think yesterday someone mentioned how mental health can be promoted through art and sharing, and there's a lack of space for graffiti or whatever. So I definitely think group settings and integrating mental health into activities that don't look like that to avoid people from being reluctant to join.
Thank you. I'm Mona from the New South Wales Premier's Department, and just touching on a little bit on what you proposed on the what was it called? MHPSS, which I really like, and I might use that abbreviation because we love abbreviations in government. But we actually ran something called the Safeguarding Social Cohesion community workshops, where post Christchurch and then post COVID, people in community, mostly community leaders and council workers, were expressing difficulties in knowing or having the skills to process trauma and helping people in their communities process trauma. So we ran a collective workshop for them. And in this way that we found that people were able to talk to their experience and learn from others. So in a way, it was more like collective healing. And just a space for them to talk was what they were looking for, which was one of the learnings from the workshops. But my question was for you as well, Isel. With MHPSS, does your study focus on when the right time is to implement something like this, because we're kind of grappling with running and not running something at the moment with the ongoing conflict, or the ongoing war in Gaza for community. And what we're doing is touching base with community a lot with our really close ties with all communities in New South Wales. But we're hearing many different things. And I was wondering, in the research, is there something that says this is the right time to implement something like this, or should it be done maybe throughout the whole process at different things done at different stages? Or if not, maybe you could direct me to something to look at that I could.
Thanks, Mona. No, I appreciate your question. I think it's important. So I can definitely refer you to a colleague of mine that actually, she also moved to Australia right after I immigrated. And she was based in Zimbabwe, where she helped communities that suffered from torture from political parties. So basically, she delivered the MHPSS there. And she's working for an organization in Queensland called QPAST. And basically, they provide these psychosocial support services to asylum seekers and to marginalized communities in Australia. I don't think that there's a right time. I think it should be integrated into any ongoing, whether it's prevention, whether it's conflict resolution, whether it's peace building, community cohesion, it should be integrated from the start to the end. But what I do think is important is understanding the need of those individuals at that point in time. Like you said, with the ongoing conflict in Gaza, that might be something to address. So, for example, a mental health or psychosocial support session, which we won't mention those words, around the Gaza conflict might look like bringing people together and asking them about how they're feeling. But there's always the right time is. It's always the right time, in my opinion. It just depends on what they specifically need in that moment. Yeah.
Any other questions? We have time for maybe one more. Going once? Going twice? All righty. Well, thank you so much. Can we get a round of applause for our panelists? So we're going to be breaking for lunch for an hour. And then after lunch, we have our last sessions of the conference. In this room, session A, we'll have a panel chaired by Winifred Lewis on support for democracy, violence, and violent extremism, understanding trajectories across time. And next door, we'll have a panel chaired by Sophie Murray-Farrell, entitled Differently Abled Actors in Violent Extremism, Emerging Challenges. Thank you so much and enjoy your lunch, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.